If you step into an elevator in almost any modern skyscraper today, you're actually participating in this massive multi-billion-dollar lie.
Oh, absolutely. It's hidden right in plain sight.
Right. You step in, you look at the panel, and you'll see buttons for floors 11, 12, and then suddenly 14. 13 is just, well, it's just completely gone. It's such a striking anomaly in our otherwise hyper-rational world.
It really is. I mean, we build these incredible monuments to engineering and physics, right? We rely on absolute rigid mathematical precision to keep these towers from falling over.
Yeah, exactly.
Yet right there on the control panel, we just willingly abandon numerical order. We just pretend the number doesn't exist.
Welcome to this deep dive. Today, our mission is to unpack the surprisingly complex, incredibly pervasive world of Triskaidekaphobia. That is the official term for the fear of the number 13.
Yes, and we will also be exploring its very famous cousin, the fear of Friday the 13th, which goes by the even more complicated name, Triskaidekaphobia.
That's a mouthful, right? But okay,
Yeah.
let's unpack this.
So we tend to brush this off as just a harmless superstition, something silly to joke about while telling ghost stories around a campfire.
Sure, like avoiding black cats or not walking under ladders.
Exactly. But the source material we are exploring today reveals that it is actually a powerful psychological force. I mean, we are looking at a phenomenon that actively dictates global real estate markets, naval architecture, massive government bureaucracies, and even the U.S. space program.
It's just wild to me. So to understand how a single, seemingly arbitrary number holds so much power over us, we need to trace the infection back to patient zero, so to speak.
Right. We have to find where it started.
Because I always assumed this was some ancient primal dread, like, I don't know, the Romans banned it, or it was etched into a cave wall somewhere by early humans.
It is completely natural to assume an entrenched cultural fear like this must have ancient origins. We always want to project these things deep into the past.
Yeah, to give it weight.
Exactly. But the earliest documented evidence of 13 being, broadly considered unlucky only dates back to post-Middle Ages Europe. There is literally no documented proof of it being a widespread ancient belief.
Wait, really? Post-Middle Ages? I mean, that is practically yesterday in the grand scheme of human civilization.
Yeah.
What actually triggered it then?
Well, we can actually trace one of the earliest associations to a parlor game of all things, specifically tarot cards.
Oh, wow, tarot cards.
Yeah. Around 1450, a specific tarot deck emerged in Italy, the Visconti Sforza deck. In this game, one of the trump cards represents death, and it was numbered 13.
No way. So it literally started as a literal card game mechanic.
Pretty much. Over the next few centuries, this specific numerical association just slowly baked into European culture. By the late 1700s, writers were stating explicitly that 13 was always considered unlucky, mostly because of this card's dark imagery.
I am just trying to picture how a local card game becomes a massive societal phobia before the internet or, mass media. It must have merged with something else people already cared about deeply.
That's a great point. It needed a bigger vehicle.
Right, like religion. Because if I recall, there's a whole superstition about 13 people sitting at a dinner table, right?
Yes, that is the other major origin point. So around the same time the Tarot Association cemented itself, we start seeing documents warning that if 13 people sit at a table together, one of them will die within a year.
That is remarkably specific and dark.
Very. A scholar in the 1770s, Johann August Ephraim Gutze, theorized that this stemmed directly from the Last Supper, where Jesus and his 12 disciples sat down for a meal. 13 people in total.
Oh, okay. And Judas, the betrayer, is the 13th person. So the narrative perfectly aligns with betrayal and death. That makes total sense.
Well, it aligns a little too perfectly, honestly.
Really?
If you read the actual biblical text, it says absolutely nothing about the seating order of the apostles. Nothing at all.
Wait, really?
Yeah. The idea that Judas was specifically the 13th to sit down was pushed heavily by English language sources much later, mostly in the 1890s. They essentially retrofitted the biblical story to match the modern fear that had already
Oh,
developed.
my gosh. It's like cultural retconning.
Yeah.
We developed a phobia and then went backward through history with a red marker, circling anything that vaguely fit our narrative to justify the fear.
What's fascinating here is that mechanism of backward justification is incredibly powerful. You see it perfectly with the myth of the Knights Templar. Have you heard the story that Friday the 13th stems from their historical arrest?
Oh, definitely. A very famous thriller novel from the early 2000s cemented that idea in my brain. You know the one?
Mm-hmm.
The story goes that King Philip of France ordered the Templars arrested on Friday, October 13th, 1307.
Right. And the date itself is actually historically accurate. King Philip did order the arrest on that specific day.
Okay, so that part is real.
It is. However, the concept of Friday the 13th being an unlucky day simply did not exist in 1307. The connection between the Templars' downfall and the modern phobia is a complete invention from the 20th century.
You're kidding.
Not at all. It was just pasted onto a real historical event to give the superstition a sense of gravitas and ancient mystery.
We literally manufactured a historical backstory to make our irrational fear feel legitimate. That is just incredible. I imagine we've done this with other mythologies too, then.
And we certainly have. In fact, in the 1960s, there was a book that tried to link the fear of 13 to a Norse myth. It claimed 12 gods were dining in Valhalla when Loki, the trickster god, crashed the party as the 13th guest.
And let me guess, that led to a god's death.
Exactly.
I mean, that sounds incredibly cinematic. Almost too neat of an origin story.
Because it is completely fabricated. The original source text for that myth, Snorri Sturluson's prose Edda, doesn't emphasize 12 gods, there is no formal dinner party, and the number 13 never even appears in the story.
Wow. So we have these hazy, fairly recent, and largely fabricated origins, yet somehow this fear leaps from tarot cards and fictionalized history books directly into the physical concrete and steel of our modern cities.
It really does.
Let's revisit that skyscraper elevator from the beginning of our deep dive, because I really want to know, how prevalent is this missing button, actually?
It is basically an industry standard. In 2002, Otis Elevators did an internal review and estimated that 85% of buildings with their elevators, specifically those over 12 floors, completely skip the 13th floor on their panels.
Wait, 85%? That is not a quirky architectural choice. That is systemic erasure.
It's massive.
I suppose if you're building an early skyscraper, going up that high was already terrifying for the general public, right?
Absolutely. Early skyscraper critics in New York were actively warning developers not to build higher than 13 floors.
What were they so afraid of?
They cited all sorts of things: ominous shadows cast over the city, severe street congestion, plummeting property values, and the very real fear of uncontrollable fires at that unprecedented height.
Ah, okay. So the sheer height was the actual hazard, but the number 13 just became the psychological scapegoat for all that anxiety.
Exactly.
But, you can't just leave a physical gap in a building structure. How are developers hiding an entire floor of square footage?
They use a variety of clever workarounds. Often they just skip the number entirely, so the panel jumps from 12 straight to 14.
Just pretending it's not there.
Right. But some developers want continuous numbering, so they will label it 12A or 12B. Others use the letter M, which is the 13th letter of the alphabet, and reserve that entire floor for mechanical equipment.
That's sneaky.
Yeah, and sometimes it gets a special designation, like the pool floor in a specific Radisson hotel in Winnipeg, or a restaurant floor.
Wait, if we just relabel the 13th floor as the 14th floor or the pool floor, it's still physically the 13th floor.
Yeah.
Are we really just tricking ourselves with a coat of paint?
And does a structural collapse or a raging fire care what the elevator button says?
Well, obviously the physical building does not care, but the real estate market absolutely does.
Money. Always money. Landlords are not erasing the number out of a genuine fear of ghosts or bad luck. They are doing it out of a fear of losing profits.
Right, because if a prospective tenant is highly superstitious, they might just back out of a lease entirely. So it is essentially an economic defense mechanism for the developers.
Precisely. And the data actually supports that economic fear. Researchers in Russia analyzed the real estate market and found that 13th floor apartments were genuinely harder to sell compared to identical units on the 12th or 14th floors.
So buyers are actively walking away from perfectly good real estate just because of the number on the door.
They walk away unless they are financially compensated for their anxiety.
What do you mean?
The researchers found that the negative effect on sales was only eliminated when developers offered a literal 10% discount on the 13th floor apartments.
Are you serious? A 10% penalty on a piece of prime real estate just for a number. That is a huge chunk of change.
It is a massive financial hit.
But, indulging this has to cause practical issues. You cannot have thousands of buildings wearing mathematical disguises without confusing someone eventually.
Which is exactly why city planners in Vancouver eventually stepped in and legally banned the practice of skipping the 13th floor.
Oh, wow. Good for them.
Yeah.
I imagine they just got tired of the aesthetic nonsense, or perhaps it was an emergency response issue.
Yeah.
Governments usually don't intervene in private building quirks unless safety is on the line.
You nailed it. It was purely a matter of public safety. In an emergency, first responders rely on incredibly accurate building data.
Right. Every second counts.
Exactly. If firefighters are coordinating a rescue, a conflict between a building's internal numbering and its actual physical floor count from the outside is incredibly dangerous. Real lives were literally being put at risk just to accommodate a psychological phantom.
Man, the Vancouver situation highlights a really fascinating tipping point. It's one thing to change a button to appease a nervous renter. It's another entirely when this phantom infiltrates high-stakes, life-and-death operations.
It crosses a line.
Totally. Let's look at naval history, because the sources mentioned that too. Sailors are notoriously superstitious, so this must have wreaked havoc on ship designations.
Oh, it severely impacted the British Navy during the First World War. They had a submarine, the HMS K-13, conducting sea trials in 1917.
And I'm guessing things didn't go well?
They didn't. It dove with several vents still open, it sank, and 32 sailors and technicians died.
Oh, it's terrible. Tragic mechanical failure. But knowing how superstition works, I am guessing the number took the blame.
The sequence of events that followed certainly cemented the blame. They raised the submarine, they repaired it, and they renamed it K-22.
Okay, fresh start.
You'd think so. But the following year, it was involved in a massive series of accidental collisions with other British submarines, an incident known as the Battle of May Island. A total of 103 men were killed.
Oh my God, so the ship sinks as the 13, gets a new coat of paint and a new name, and then is involved in an even bigger disaster.
Yes.
I mean, you can completely understand why a sailor would refuse to board anything tangentially related to that number after that.
The Navy clearly understood the psychological toll it took on the men. When they developed their subsequent L class of submarines, they completely skipped the designation L-13. They just went from 12 to 14.
And this psychological phantom does not stop at the ocean surface. It goes all the way into the atmosphere.
It goes all the way to space.
Yes. The Apollo 13 mission is probably the most famous use of the number in modern history.
It is. Apollo 13 launched on April 11th, 1970. And the launch time was exactly 13.13 Central Standard Time.
Come on. You couldn't script that if you tried.
I know, it's wild. And then 2 days later, on April 13th, an oxygen tank exploded. It aborted the moon landing and turned the entire mission into a desperate fight for survival.
Which they thankfully survived.
Yes, the crew safely returned. But the shadow of that near disaster lingered heavily over the agency. During the subsequent space shuttle program, NASA entirely avoided the name STS-13.
Wait, NASA? An organization built on absolute, uncompromising physics and mathematics actively avoided a number.
Well, officially, NASA claimed the naming system changed because of a higher frequency of planned launches.
Oh, sure they did.
Yeah, they implemented this very complex matrix where the first number was the fiscal year, the second was the launch site, followed by a letter. Consequently, the 11th flight, which would have naturally been STS-13, became STS-41C.
That is incredibly convenient timing for a bureaucratic spreadsheet update.
The astronauts on that specific flight certainly noticed the avoidance.
They weren't buying it.
Not at all. They weren't superstitious and actually designed a humorous alternate mission patch featuring a black cat in the number 13. And ironically, they ended up landing back on Earth on Friday the 13th.
No way.
Yeah, which the crew just described as, quote, pretty cool.
I just love that image. Astronauts mocking the superstition in orbit while administrators down on Earth are actively trying to hide the number in a filing cabinet somewhere.
It's a great contrast.
But this panic isn't just about physical danger in space or at sea. It creates literal economic terror. The Irish license plate crisis of 2012 is a perfect example of this.
The Irish situation is a remarkable case study in how fear can actively shape national economies. In Ireland, vehicle registration plates begin with the year of the car. So, a car registered in 2011 starts with 11, 2012 starts with 12, and so forth.
Meaning the impending year 2013 was a looming existential threat for the entire auto industry.
Exactly. The Society of the Irish Motor Industry was legitimately panicking. The economy was already a bit fragile at the time, and they feared that superstitious drivers would simply refuse to purchase a new car if the license plate loudly broadcasted a 13 on the front and back bumpers.
This is incredible. The Irish license plate story is basically a government administering a massive societal placebo.
That's a great way to put it.
They actively altered bureaucratic code to accommodate a magical curse so the auto economy wouldn't tank. How does a placebo like that actually work in practice?
Well, the underlying anxiety remains in the public, but you treat the symptom to relieve the financial pressure. The government intervened and split the registration system just for that specific year.
How do they split it?
Vehicles registered in the first half of 2013 received plates starting with 131, and those in the second half received plates starting with 132. By simply adding a single digit, the entire crisis was averted.
It is wild how the human brain processes that. 13, terrifying. I will crash my car immediately. 131, perfectly safe, here's my money.
It's completely irrational.
We have entire governments and billion-dollar industries just bending the knee to this fear. Has anyone ever looked at this collective delusion and tried to, actively fight back against it?
Actually, there have been organized counter movements throughout history. A really notable one was the 13 Club.
The 13 Club.
Yeah, it was established in 1881 by a U.S. Civil War veteran named Captain William Fowler. He gathered influential New Yorkers with the explicit stated goal of killing off superstitions.
I mean, how do you kill an idea that pervasive?
By weaponizing exposure therapy, they just leaned into it as hard as humanly possible. Their inaugural dinner was held on January 13th, 1881. At exactly 8:300 p.m.
Oh, I love the commitment.
It gets better. 13 people sat in room 13. To even enter the dining room, guests had to physically walk under a ladder, and they ate their meals surrounded by piles of spilled salt.
That sounds like an incredibly theatrical dinner party. But did it work? Did they break the cultural curse?
Well, the clubs became a massive cultural phenomenon for a time. They spread across North America. Astonishingly, 5 future U.S. presidents actually joined their ranks, including Theodore Roosevelt.
Wow, so they had real political weight behind them.
They did. But while the clubs eventually faded away due to a lack of sustained interest, the superstitions themselves proved much more resilient. They survived the attempts to kill them.
I find it fascinating that the fear is so stubborn here, yet it isn't a universal human truth. We've been focusing heavily on North America and Europe, but a numbers power is entirely dependent on its zip code.
If we connect this to the broader global picture, the cultural relativity of numbers reveals how incredibly arbitrary these fears truly are. In many regions, 13 is actually a symbol of fortune.
Really? Where?
Well, before the First World War, 13 was considered extremely lucky in France. It was often featured on good luck charms and postcards. And in modern Italy, 13 is broadly seen as lucky, except, of course, when you were sitting at a dinner table.
Right. The Last Supper rule still applies there. And in Asia, linguistics dictate entirely different phobias, don't they?
Language is an incredibly powerful catalyst for these beliefs.
Yeah.
In Cantonese-speaking areas like Hong Kong, 13 is considered very lucky because its pronunciation sounds similar to the phrase, sure to live.
Oh, that's beautiful.
It is. But contrast that with the number 14, which sounds dangerously close to the phrase, sure to die.
So a numbers power is literally just a linguistic pun, and you see this arbitrary assignment of luck everywhere. I was reading the sources about Colgate University. They were founded by 13 men with $13 and 13 prayers. To them, Friday the 13th is literally a day of celebration.
Exactly. It's all about context.
And Taylor Swift famously paints the number 13 on her hand before concerts. And legendary athletes like Dan Marino built entire, highly successful careers wearing it on their jerseys.
Which brings us to other numbers that suffer the exact same fate as 13 in different parts of the world. In many East Asian countries, including China, Japan, Korea, and Vietnam, the number 4 is heavily stigmatized. This is known as tetraphobia.
Let me guess, another pun.
Exactly. In Mandarin, the word for 4 sounds almost identical to the word for death. This association is so incredibly strong that the Finnish mobile phone giant Nokia actively avoided using the number 4 in most of their model series just to respect the Asian market.
A massive global tech corporation altering its entire product lineup over a homophone. That is staggering. Does Europe have its own localized number terrors beyond 13?
Yes. In Italy, the true source of numerical anxiety is 17 heptadecaphobia.
Wait, 17. Why?
This one stems from Roman numerals. 17 is written as X7. If you rearrange those specific letters, you create the word vic12, which in Latin translates to I have lived.
Which is a very polite past tense way of saying I am currently dead.
That is exactly the implication. Because of this simple anagram, you will find Italian airlines with no row 17 and hotels completely missing room 17. Meanwhile, in Afghanistan, the number 39 is widely considered a cursed badge of shame, to the point where people will pay to avoid license plates containing it.
So this conclusively proves that the fear of a specific number is not hardwired into human psychology at all. The numerical value itself is entirely meaningless.
It's a blank slate.
Right. It just depends on local language puns, historical accidents, or whether your favorite quarterback won a championship wearing it.
That is the core insight of all these sources, really. Whether a property manager is skipping an elevator floor, or NASA is renaming a space shuttle, or a fan is clutching a lucky number at a concert. Modern humans are engaging in the exact same behavior as our ancestors centuries ago.
We haven't really changed that much, have we?
Not at all. The universe is chaotic, and it's unpredictable. By projecting power onto an arbitrary symbol, like a painted number, we give ourselves an illusion of control over that chaos.
It is a psychological coping mechanism to organize the unknown. Which, brings me to a final thought I want to leave you, our listener, with. In the source material, there's a fascinating observation from a sociologist named Otto Neurath.
Ah, yes.
He looked at this entire phenomenon, the omitted 13th floors, the relabeling, the altered Irish license plates, and he compared it to the use of money in an economy. He called both of them merely a social convention.
That's a profound way to look at it.
Right. Think about those Vancouver city planners we discussed earlier.
Yeah.
They had to legally ban the skipping of the 13th floor because our imaginary social conventions were interfering with literal life-and-death emergency rescues. The firefighters couldn't find the real floor because the building was wearing a mathematical disguise.
It became a physical danger.
Yeah.
Exactly. It makes you wonder, as you navigate your day, walking through buildings and making financial decisions, what other invisible, completely irrational social conventions are entirely shaping the physical world around you, right under your nose?